So my name is Jacqueline Philpott. Good morning. I'm the Executive Director of the Association of Film Commissioners International, otherwise known as AFCI. It's great to see some of our members on this call, and some of you are new faces for me too. So for those of you who may not be aware, AFCI was established in the United States in 1975 and grew to become a global membership organisation with film commissions at its heart. We are the only organisation in the world that trains film commissions, and AFCI undertakes a number of other key activities related to global events and activations at festivals and film markets worldwide. We also are involved in research, insights, and we provide guidance for emerging regions looking to set up an office. Let's get those other people in here. We'd like to also welcome Olsberg SBI to the call this morning. Olsberg are a great friend of AFCI, and we've been working with them for a number of years. As we approach our 50th anniversary, which is next year, a new strategy was released and we're in transformation mode. We're welcoming new members into the organisation to bring industry closer to our film commissions and their regions. We really appreciate you all taking the time to be on this call from all over the world. The following presentation is a collaboration between AFCI and Olsberg and a much needed update to an existing 2019 report released on best practice in screen sector development. Again, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank the team at Olsberg for undertaking a significant piece of work, and to Netflix for their support also. Without this collaboration, it would not be possible to bring this to you today. Before I hand it over to Jonathan today, a couple of little housekeeping items. The call is being recorded, so it can be made available on our website within 24 hours for you to watch again or share at a later date with your teams. Feel free to ask questions in the chat, and we'll also ensure there is time at the end for you too. And if you have any further questions about the call, AFCI, or if you'd like Olsberg SBI to complete another presentation for you, your organisation or industry colleagues, please reach out and I'll be sure to add the details in the chat shortly. So let's get this show on the road. Thank you everybody so much for being here, and over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline. It's great to see old friends and to meet new friends on this in this meeting. We're delighted to be sharing this work with you. I've got my colleagues, Leon Ford, our managing director, who managed the whole project of getting this report written, and also Kaylee Hughes, a consultant at SBI, who's the primary author of the report, and they and I together will be available for questions at the end of the session. And I just want to underline what Jacqueline said. If it would be helpful for any of you to have us present this work in your country or region to your stakeholders or whomever, we'd be absolutely delighted to do so. So without further ado, Leon, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thanks, Jonathan. And actually, Kaylee will kick off our presentation. And really, just before Kelly jumps in, this is a very detailed and lengthy study of well over 100 pages. We'll give you very quick headlines in this session today, but I would encourage you, if you haven't already, to download the full study and give it a read. There's a lot more case studies, for example, than we have in today's deck. But Kaylee.
Thanks, Leon. Thanks, Jonathan. So to echo a couple of points that have already been made, this is an update on a report that we first published in 2019. We've now expanded on this. So the 2019 edition looked at best practice in production incentives, workforce capacity, infrastructure, and film friendliness. In this edition, we've expanded that to include those 4 areas, but also look at diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, sustainability, and partner engagement. And this was a collaboration with AFCI, and was undertaken with financial support from Netflix. And as Leon mentioned, the report is quite long. It's about 116 pages of really detailed analysis around each of those 7 areas, as well as industry context and trends going forward, and quite a substantial bibliography for reports and other research that's worth looking into. And that also included 19 case studies. To partner that, because 116 pages is a lot, we have a shorter 60-page document that summarizes the full report, focusing in on the key findings of those 7 research areas. And that document has been published in 11 languages. So that includes English, but also French, Portuguese, and Spanish, as well as a number of others. And I'll pass back to Leon to give some context and industry points.
Thanks, Kaylee. So yeah, before we jump into the kind of meat of the presentation and look at what we mean by best practice and look at what best practice what best practice is in terms of policy or regulation or other types of development, just to provide some context of the current global production landscape. And as Kelly and Jacqueline said, the last time we did this study was in 2019, and obviously we're in a really markedly different industry landscape now. I mean, definitely in 2019, as you'll see from the graph on the right, which is some FX Networks data on the number of US scripted original series, we were very much in a strong, unprecedented upwards sort of production deluge. And obviously, we've seen some shocks in the industry since then. We've seen obviously the effects of COVID-19 on the production shutdowns. We've seen the effects of coming out of the COVID-19 restrictions and the rapid and strong return to production in many territories. And then more recently, we've seen the challenges in coming out of the US market with the labor action over the past year. And that's continuing to still play out in terms of production flows and how production gets placed around the world. And moving to the next slide, that said, we still, the data still show a lot of strength in the market. Certainly, we're looking at developing markets for a lot of that growth, but this is some Ampere analysis data that you'll see on screen, looking at 22 to 2028, and still predicting a lot of growth in the global streaming market, where obviously a lot of the investment over the past 5 years has come from. And Ampere is predicting a lot of that growth to come from emerging regions, particularly in terms of the European context, from Central and Eastern Europe, but also areas or regions like Central South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, where obviously there's a lot of sectoral development going on right now, and to a lesser degree in the APAC region. So still a great deal of runway for growth. And even if the content spend on production in Western Europe is forecast to be flat, there's obviously still a strong opportunity for producers and creators of content in Western Europe to find emerging, and new audiences globally. So just moving to the next slide as well, to reflect on the incentives landscape, and we'll return to this when we start talking about best practice, because obviously incentives play such a central role when we're talking about policy and development strategy for the sector. But as a region, Europe obviously is a very well established market for incentives. It's they're pretty much common in most European territories at this point, and you'll see a time series from 2017 to 2024, an increase from 26 to 34. Actually, interestingly, not as fast a growth curve as we see on a global level, because Europe was already very well established in terms of incentive provision. In terms of the latest data that we've just collated in our incentives index, there is currently 120 automatic incentive systems at country, state, or province level globally. Just under 35 of those in Europe, and in this region, there's obviously a good mix of very, very established territories and territories that are still establishing their production ecosystems and building out in some of the areas we'll be talking about today. I think the thing to underline, or two things to underline here, is that incentives in Europe are critical for inward projects, as they are everywhere, but they're also particularly critical for national or domestic production. And we're seeing a lot of movement in that focus area, the need to drive, investment in domestic film and television, given some of the market finance challenges that those sectors have seen. And we've seen that in a number of European territories. The UK, for example, has its new audiovisual expenditure credit for UK independent film, which has just been introduced. So a lot of focus on the domestic as well as the inward in many countries around Europe. Kaylee.
So just a bit about the best practice methodology in the study before we jump into the key findings and case studies. As we've already mentioned, there are 7 interrelated areas that we looked at in this report. And a successful market really has a strong offer across all of these 7, although it is quite bespoke to each market. So there is no one size fits all for exactly what will work in each location, but a combination of these 7 is really important for consideration. And then we won't be touching on it in this presentation, but in the report, we also look at ineffective practice. So this is anything that may inhibit an ability to grow or develop a sector, things that will stymie the sort of strategic growth that everyone is looking for. And in the report, we look at best practice in 2 different types. We look at formal interventions. So that's some more larger scale things like legislation, strategies, guidelines, and then informal interventions are the processes, procedures, and initiatives that enable those formal interventions to take place. That occurs across all 7 of those research areas, although again, some will be more towards the formal or informal interventions, depending on specifics. And by meeting a good combination of those, an industry will be really responsive to any changing sectoral needs. It'll be relevant for both domestic and international productions to make sure that they're able to work and be produced smoothly. They'll be informed by producer needs and what those needs are throughout the production process. They'll target both the national and regional levels, or sub-regional as it may be. And then any of these informal and formal interventions will be regularly reviewed to ensure that they're effective and relevant to the day's needs. And then we will be going into detail about 5 case studies that we completed for this study, although they're they're a summarized version in this presentation and are in a lot more detail in the report. But this is just the larger list of case studies, and this was produced after a significant amount of consultation with producers and line producers and other people in the industry about what they have witnessed working, what they've seen as really strong case study examples, and then a good combination of desk research, interviews and consultations, and reviewing processes. And we took care to have a mix of both emerging and established markets and tried to have as global a view as possible. But of course, this is the tip of the iceberg. There are a lot of other great examples across all 7 areas that could also be included, and we just weren't able without having a 300-page report. So I'll pass back over to Leon to start with the key findings.
Thanks, Kaylee. So what we'll do now is run through each of those 7 areas and pull out some of the key, the key condensed points about what we have identified as representing best practice, and we'll pull out a couple of the case studies very rapidly for you. And as I said earlier, production incentives are they're a cornerstone policy for pretty much all successful production markets globally. I think in our view, they're pretty flexible models that can be deployed in different ways. And I think one really interesting trend over the last 5 years has been the way that policymakers have taken different approaches to incentives and used them in different ways to try and hit different sort of strategic objectives. Running through some of the key points we identify in this study, reducing uncertainty, process speed, these are financial instruments in which the jurisdiction will invest in the production that is being stimulated. They've become very important for many producers in financing their projects, and particularly, I talked a bit about the changed context in which this study has been done. One of the big, the big sort of negative trends, if you like, has been the emergence of very high cost inflation in the sector, and I think that has redoubled the need for incentives for both independent producers and larger studio and streamer volume producers. But when that comes, what that means for usage of incentives is that models that reduce uncertainties, models that are administered quickly and clearly are far and away the models that represent best practice. That's not to say that incentives shouldn't be robustly administered, because it's absolutely critical for for the governments or jurisdictions that invest in these models that they're being deployed carefully and robustly, and that there are checks and balances in place. But at the same time, from the producer perspective, any system that doesn't pay out or that can take many years to pay out, the cost of money has got higher. It makes them much less attractive if there is inbuilt uncertainty about payment or when that payment will come through. I've mentioned domestic producers a couple of times, but I think in our view, a healthy screen sector policy is one that is, that covers both the domestic and the independent industry, but also the inward. And, one policy or one strategy that only foregrounds one of those areas is less likely to be successful than a policy that spans both. And that's because of the interrelated nature of, domestic and inward production. To have strong inward, you need a skills base and an infrastructure base and a supply chain. And similarly for domestic producers, if a system is working well, there will be higher end talent being developed on larger shows that can work across both. Budgets and caps, not every system is able to operate on an uncapped basis, but there are definitely models of or different types of approach that function better, and we'll talk a bit about Austria shortly. But that's an example of a system that has found a good balance between caps and accessibility for projects. Then thinking about targeted uplifts, this has been as I mentioned earlier regarding the flexibility of incentives. One area we've seen significant expansion in is around uplifts. So an incentive guidelines or legislation will offer an increase in value if the project is hitting certain strategic marks, whether that's filming in a certain part of the country or jurisdiction, or hiring in certain ways. They can be very, very positive, and they can lead to behavior change among producers to hit whatever that jurisdiction is trying to hit. But to be, best practice here is definitely, establishing an uplift that is clear, that is accessible, and that is usable for producers, and making sure that when an uplift is being designed, that it is enabling that behavior change to happen. So if it's offering an uplift for shooting in a certain jurisdiction or a certain part of a country, making sure that it's even possible for productions to shoot there. Are there hotels, are there crew, etc., etc. And then finally, on effective value, links back to what I was saying earlier about the certainty of a system and the stability of a system. Increasingly, And as I was saying, given cost inflation, a lot of producers, a lot of financial managers of companies and of productions are taking a very close magnifying glass to how an incentive will net out on their production. So if it's marketed at 30%, what is it actually going to deliver for that production once certain ineligible cost types have been taken out? Maybe there's no eligibility for above the line. What does that actually then mean for that production? And I think there's a very wide understanding now of the marketed rate being different to an effective rate. And I think having that gap be as low as possible is better for the jurisdiction. Offering a realistic number in marketing is going to avoid any unpleasant surprises for producers when they actually come to realize that the rate might actually be significantly lower. So moving on, those are some of the headline findings. I mentioned Austria in terms of caps, and this is a very interesting case study in our view. Austria's visa incentive had been operating for several years, but in 2022 ran out of budget by the end of March, and that had a particular impact on domestic producers who rely upon the incentive for financing. So the government in Austria developed a new incentive called Visa Plus, which is an uncapped system. Overall, there's no sort of annual cap on the system, but there is a project cap on the system of around 5 million euros or 7.5 million euros for feature films. And that means the incentive can't be exhausted. It can continue to service production all year round, assuming production is coming through the pipeline. But what that means is the government is able to manage the scale of incentive while ensuring that eligible productions are able to use it. And in terms of impact, we've seen that incentive being used by international producers as well as the domestic producers who use the previous visa model, and has definitely stimulated the Austrian sector more broadly. And again, that in terms of lessons from that, best practice lessons, underlines our view in the study that incentives are as important for domestic as they are for international producers, and also that there are definitely best practice ways of looking at cap management. And we see some models that have a first come first served window, for example, and the window gets exhausted within a very short amount of time, which means there might not be any incentive provision for quite a long period of time. So the Austrian model definitely helps with sort of sustainability of that incentive. So that's one case study. As Kelly said, there's a lot more detail and insight in all of these areas in the full report. But moving on from incentives to workforce capacity. So again, a totally critical area, very much a global sort of pinch point in recent years, as the industry has struggled in many jurisdictions to develop the workforce and the skills levels that are needed to deliver the productions that are being made. So we do a lot of work in this area. We did a lot of analysis for this study to look at, well, if you want to develop screen workforce, screen talent, screen crew, how can that be done in a way that can rapidly service the industry, but also give the industry what it needs? And I think everyone will be familiar with the sort of complaint that there might be a lot of training around, but not everyone is emerging from those training courses ready to go on set. So I think first, best practice finding here is about targeted intervention, and it's about making sure that as a jurisdiction, as a country, wherever we're talking about, that the strategy for workforce development is focusing on the right things. And that links to the point on the right about data collection. And the fact is, as everybody knows, this is a very challenging sector when it comes to data, and particularly when it comes to cast and crew data, given how itinerant people who work in the industry are, itinerant both, across Europe, across the world, or certainly within a national jurisdiction. Crews can very often move around and work in different places. So that creates some real challenges for data collection and data monitoring, but definitely finding a strategy that is underpinned by data on crews, and particularly data on crew gaps, so that workforce interventions address those gaps rather than provide more and more workers in an area that isn't a key point of industry need. And then finally, and we'll talk about this a bit more when we come to DEI, but cohesive strategies. So making sure that all potential avenues are being included in that sort of workforce capacity development. For example, thinking about bringing skills sideways into the industry, we see a lot of skills development focusing on early career or new entrant training, which is obviously key and is necessary. But what we also have seen in some best practice examples is the moving people sideways from other careers who have already built skills that are relevant for the screen sector. So, for example, with production accountants, there's bringing trained accountants from other sectors, giving them the training that they need to operate in the screen production sector. And that bypasses a lot of on-the-job training, a lot of experience if the training is right. And just moving on to the next slide, this is a case study from Screen Island on the workforce capacity issue, and we identify this as a key area of best practice because of Screen Island's competency framework, as they call it. And if you aren't aware of this, I do encourage you to take a look at it if you're interested in the workforce capacity area. So Screen Island developed this framework in collaboration with the Screen Guilds of Ireland and other partners. And it's really about creating a library of tools to track skills and to define and track competencies across different production departments. So, coming up with definitions of what jobs involve, and creating a framework for, and statements about what each crew job involves. And really we think this is best practice because it's a really innovative template for tracking skills and also helping people in the industry understand where their levels are at. If they're working in a job, what's expected of them if they're going to move up to the next role on set. So it's about demystifying some of the lack of clarity around how to get into the sector and how to progress through the sector. And also, in terms of the earlier point about aligning training with industry needs, it also is a clear mechanism for linking very targeted training with what the industry needs. And then in terms of impacts, Screen Island has been forming partnerships with education providers and also expanding that framework to other content production sectors. For example, in the animation sector, it introduced a separate framework there. And then lessons in best practice, it's, as I said earlier, it's about a cohesive strategy. So bringing together guilds, associations, training providers, industry, and really having everyone work on moving this forward together. And then treating the framework as a guide for the industry to move forward, and having it be robust and transparent so that anyone in or out of the sector can look at this framework and understand progression and definition of roles. So that's workforce. I'll hand to Kaylee to talk about infrastructure.
Thanks, Leon. So for infrastructure, we're talking specifically about physical infrastructure, such as studios, both purpose-built and pop-ups or conversions. Although this does also broadly talk about that wider ecosystem, so vendors that would also be necessary for a successful infrastructure environment for screen production. There are 4 main areas to cover in terms of best practice. The first is about timing. Infrastructure is, as I'm sure everyone is aware, quite a significant investment, especially if you're going the purpose-built route, to make sure that it is suited to all sorts of production needs. And it is also quite a lengthy process. So one of the key areas of best practice is making sure that any investment, particularly public investment into infrastructure, is coming at the right time. Because as we've discussed already with the other research areas, and we'll cover in the others, a lot of this is about how these various pieces fit together. And so you don't want to spend or prioritize infrastructure development at the expense of building a workforce crew who could then work on the productions. So it's important to make sure that there is demand for the sector and for infrastructure in the sector, and potentially consider focusing on things like a production incentive, other financial funding options, or even crew development before moving into infrastructure funding, infrastructure development. And then another point is around pop-up or converted infrastructure. And these first two areas are actually quite relevant to the case study, Bristol case study I'll mention in just a moment. But in addition to purpose-built, which is obviously the sort of gold standard, ensuring that everything is being built to specification for a film production, pop-up and converted infrastructure can also be really suitable for a number of different types of productions, especially in an emerging market where perhaps there's still a degree of market testing going on to make sure that there is consistent demand that will need infrastructure. In some places where location shooting is the predominant form of production taking place, there may be less need for that sort of purpose-built studio development. And the converted infrastructure can be built quite quickly. So if there is a need for production, that is also an option that should be considered. Then there's also the question of non-financial support. This is specifically referring to from governments or other local authorities, and whether or not, and in terms of any financial or non-financial support they may provide. Some public bodies will fund or invest in infrastructure development. Some won't or won't be able to, but can support the development in other ways. So it could be about streamlining the process, making sure that any regulations or application processes are in place to make it as suitable a process as possible and as painless a process as possible. It could be about helping and working with productions to find suitable pop-up locations for productions that are occurring before more permanent infrastructure can be developed. And it could be looking at other ways that they can motivate the local sector to support the production. And then finally, environmental sustainability is increasingly a focus for infrastructure, looking at how, whether it's a converted infrastructure or a purpose-built, how sustainability can be factored into this in terms of the materials used, setting it up for use with more environmentally friendly generators or other power supplies, waste management, and a number of other factors. So one of the case studies in this area was in Bristol in the UK and looking at the Bottle Yard Studios. And this is a council-owned studio development that was originally a bottling factory that was then converted into a studio space. And the development of the Bottle Yard Studios came after a feasibility study that was commissioned by the Bristol City Council into whether this was a viable alternative for studio development outside London. So it was a really considered, careful process. They took a lot of care to make sure that there was market demand for production in Bristol, and that there would be continued work in the area. And then there's been continued investment by local authorities into the bottle yards, and most recently in 2022, another 3 new sound stages were developed in Bottle Yard Studios 2. So these were a relatively low cost approach to developing a studio facility that could be used in Bristol. It used existing council-owned buildings. It required minimal conversion. So as far as cost and investment went, there wasn't a huge amount of outlay there. But one of the most important things was that it was able to demonstrate the increased demand for studio space outside of London and in the Bristol, West of England region. And it was affordable for the local industry. So local producers were able to rent the stages for their own productions and develop a really sustainable local industry, which then had a knock-on effect of building crew base and other vendors in the region that were able to anchor themselves because of this studio. And as a result, as a studio, it's been really central to developing Bristol as a regional production hub. There's been a number of productions hosted there from the BBC and ITV, and also Netflix, Disney, and a lot of others. It also involves a number of local tenants at the site, both in terms of vendors, but also training and development groups. And it's, in terms of a quote from one of the local authorities, they noted that it's become the largest dedicated film and television studio facility in the west of England, and it's transformed a disused industrial space into a vibrant and busy creative hub. And just on that point, we have another case study that isn't in this presentation, but also centers on Bristol and DEI. And it's very possible that without the Bottle Yard Studios providing this anchor for productions and enabling sort of a consistent level of production activity, that some of those initiatives for workforce and DEI and other developments maybe wouldn't be happening, at least to the same degree as they currently are. So this kind of considered approach that allows the industry to develop at a really natural pace and build skills for the workforce, build experience, is a really sustainable way to develop a local sector. So onto film friendliness, and just with an eye on time, I'm going to make sure we get through these next few quickly so that there's room for questions if anyone has any. Film friendliness is referring to the ease in which a production can take place in a country or a jurisdiction. So it covers everything from people being aware of a location as a possible production location, but also any permitting or application processes being as streamlined and clear as possible. I think sometimes some of these various elements can be quite opaque, and that can be a real obstacle for productions, especially if they're working on quite tight deadlines. And so one of the most important things is around building consensus, because while you will have a film office or a film commission and film-specific vendors and organizations, there's also a lot of people in the screen industry that aren't purely working in the screen industry. So whether that's police or immigration, customs, other local council departments that maybe have permits that are required for production. So it's important to make sure that everyone understands the role that they play, and make sure that they're all collaborating and working to create an environment that's really suitable for production. And that also leads into the access and understanding, making sure that people do understand the role that they're playing, and also the value and benefit of production occurring in their location, so that their understanding of what is involved. And then both the permitting processes, immigration, customs, tax, and other regulations, it's really essential that these are clear processes, that they're readily available, that there isn't a huge amount of red tape, and ideally that there is a consistent time frame in terms of processing these elements, so that production can continue uninhibited. In terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, Leon already mentioned how important DEI and workforce are in terms of working together and collaborating. In the 2019 report, this was originally part of the workforce chapter, and but we felt that it was important enough that it needed its own space in the report to dig into some of those key areas of best practice and ineffective practice. So integration into workforce development is key, making sure that if a workforce development strategy or intervention program is being implemented, the diversity, equity, and inclusion is being considered from the start rather than added towards the end. Similarly, regular data collection is also incredibly important, and that can be quite challenging with DEI because there can be rules about what can and cannot be collected, but it's important to try and maintain a record of how effective any DEI practices or interventions have been, and try to monitor how that's continuing into the future. So has there been if certain groups have been enticed into the screen sector, do they stay in the workforce or do they move into other sectors after a handful of years? Understanding where these programs lead is really important. And then a big part of that is around community engagement. In a number of the reports that we've done, we've found that for a lot of people, sometimes the screen industry can be quite opaque, which is one of the reasons the Screen Island competency framework is so great. It removes a lot of the difficulty in understanding what the industry is. But when it comes to DEI, we also find that a lot of groups just don't think of screen as a suitable or a possible industry for them. And so community engagement is a really great way to make sure that you are engaging with education providers, local organizations, local community groups, whoever it may be, to make sure that any interventions that you're introducing are reaching the people that you're wanting to reach, and that they understand what's available to them and what those next steps are. And then with time, I won't talk about effective complaints systems and authentic representation in detail, but they are both in the report and are also both key areas of best practice to make sure that people feel welcome in the industry, and also that they have a voice that they can continue to use throughout their career. And then the final area from me is around sustainability. And in terms of key areas of best practice, this is not a new area overall, but is increasingly an important area and is becoming more of a priority. So we're seeing a lot of countries or jurisdictions introducing it may be incentive uplifts around sustainability or other ways of trying to encourage sustainable practices on set and in productions. A few things that are really important is around ensuring that whatever is introduced is suitable for that jurisdiction and location. It needs to be, in order to be able to be habit forming, it needs to be something that people can engage with readily and integrate into their workplace. So whatever requirements may be introduced or suggested, ensuring that there are vendors able to provide more sustainable, energy efficient generators or waste management or catering, all of those things. It's important to make sure that there is a network of vendors and providers available, and that it isn't too onerous to try and meet those sorts of targets. And as that continues, that will help to normalize the shift, and people will begin to think about sustainable practices as an everyday part of their production planning, which is critical to making sure that this does continue. And then an important part and consideration as well is around incentivizing change. So what needs to be done, what can be done to encourage people to make these sorts of sustainable decisions when they're planning a production. So that could be something like a sustainable uplift around green production, but it can also just be around rewarding or acknowledging good practices, and making sure that people see the benefits and see the impact that implementing these sorts of sustainable practices have, both on a production and larger scale level. Which leads into the sustainability case study. BAFTA Albert is an organization that is a best practice case study in and of itself, but in particular, in the report, we were looking at the studio sustainability standard. This is a voluntary assessment that participating studios can take part in, and it provides them with a performance report and a grade, which helps to benchmark where their progress is with other facilities who have participated in the sustainability standard. So it looks to encourage and celebrate and aid gains in sustainable practice adoption across studios through education, incentivization, and transparency, which is also mirrors Albert's larger organization objectives and goals. So any participating studio is required to complete a scorecard, which looks at these 6 themes around sustainable practices and principles, which is climate, circularity, nature, people, management, and data. And then following that, any of those participating studios received an anonymized report with their scores. But critically, it also provides advice and recommendations in terms of how they can improve in each of those 6 areas. So it's not just about assessing, it's also about giving them the tools to improve in the future. So the first report in 2022-23 had 12 participating studios. The latest report, which was for 2023-24, that increased to 29 studios globally. 8 of 10 studios who participated in both of those reports saw an increase in their scores. So they implemented those recommendations and saw their grades improve, their sustainability grades. And then as a key example, the report's case study goes into much more detail. Sky Studios Elstree in the UK received an outstanding award and overall score of 95%, which was the highest for any participating studio globally. And Sky Studios Elstree, sustainability was at the forefront when they were developing and planning that studio. But in terms of lessons, so part of the success is around leveraging the appeal of being recognized in the report as a way to motivate industry engagement. But then critically, it's also about that balance of measuring and scoring the sustainability practices that are in place, but also providing those recommendations and innovations. So trying to continue to better and improve the industry year on year. So Leon, I will pass back over to you for the last research area.
Thanks, Kaylee. So just the last couple of slides before we take any questions. The 7th area is partner engagement, and this is a new area for the study since the 2019 version. And really, this is reflecting on the increased attention that many organizations or agencies in the screen development space, the need for them to explain and engage with various types of partners about the value of the sector. So a few findings here. One is, that identifying the key partners is critical. Whether that's in government or in, thinking about film-friendly aims. Making sure that that the partners in police or immigration are identified, and once those partners are identified, giving them the right kind of evidence. So, for governments, it can often be economic evidence is what helps, get them committed, or it could be more strategic evidence. And the messaging and evidence needed there has to be robust. It has to be independent, and it has to be, very clear about how it's delivered, so that if economic data is going into government, it's equivalent to how the government is receiving data for other sectors, and that also the government has the opportunity to examine the methodologies involved and understand how it's been done. Then one area here is about correcting erroneous or negative assumptions, and Kaylee alluded to this. This is a sector that is globally recognized, globally known, but in some ways, not everybody is aware of just, of what is involved in making very high-profile film and television productions, and the amount of staff that are needed and the amount of money that is needed. So I think there's often a job to do in engaging with partners to explain erroneous assumptions and sometimes negative assumptions about what the sector is. Just moving to the next slide. This is a very brief sort of example of typical partners that, agencies or film commissions or whoever it might be are looking to reach, for example, central government, key ministries, and so on. The private sector, it might be more about banks and insurers and driving their activation in the sector. And then maybe on the more film-friendly side, thinking about public authorities like immigration, permitting entities, and so on. And then just the final slide is a case study on the International Sami Film Institute, which has been a client of ours. And this is a screen agency dedicated to nurturing the Sami community's filmmaking capabilities. We included this as a best practice case study because of that institute's success and ability to forge strategic partnerships with Nordic and international entities, which have in turn sort of facilitated financial investment, training, and the wider distribution of Sami content. And again, the effectiveness of this case study is about how that institute has identified partners and engaged with partners to further knowledge about what it's doing, and being very, very proactive as well. And then in terms of impacts, there's a lot of examples about the institute being able to attract and sort of identify partners to invest or provide other sort of strategic support. And then in terms of lessons, it's very clear that strategic partnerships are a huge benefit in driving a healthy screen sector. So that's a very quick run through that, and our contacts are in the chat if anyone would like to reach out directly, or please do ask any questions that you might have, and we can do our best to answer them. But thank you very much for listening and for joining today. Much appreciated. And thanks again to AFCI.
Thanks, Leon. Thanks, Kaylee. Thanks, Jonathan. Is there any questions from anyone at this point? No? Okay, well, as mentioned, thank you so much for being on the call this morning. Our contacts are in the chat, and this will be up on our website within the next 24 hours. So we wish you well. Thank you. Have a wonderful day ahead, and we'll see you soon. Thank you. Take care.